Hey, welcome back to Strategy Shorts. This is episode 8, How to Play Around Cards. For those not familiar with the term, or who don't know what it means yet, playing around cards is playing in such a way that you mitigate the impact of one or more of your opponent's cards that you're particularly concerned with. So for instance, you might spread your units out so that the Mercantile Warbeast is less effective because it likes to hit things that are all bunched up together. One of the most important ways, and common ways to play around a card is to choose which units you play and where you play them, which spells you play in the turns leading up to your opponent playing that card so that it's less effective than it would normally be. For instance, as a simple example, you're playing against Magma, right? They have Plasma Storm in their deck. Plasma Storm kills units with power 3 or less, so the turn before they would go into being able to play Plasma Storm, where they would have 5 mana, you can play a Thunderhorn, which is 4 power, and doesn't die to it. Similarly, they can also play Lava Slasher, which deals 4 damage to something, so you might play the same Thunderhorn, which has 5 health, and doesn't die to Lava Slasher either. And so by just playing your normal unit on curve, just jamming my Thunderhorn on turn 4, my opponent doesn't have good 5 mana answers to it. Today, I'm going to talk about the process of learning to play around everything in their deck. Because the ideal goal is you don't just say, oh, they could play Lava Slasher next turn, I'll play this 4-5. But you go into each game thinking, alright, what do they have? They have Natural Selection, Homeostatic Rebuke, Golem Metallurgist, Lava Slasher, blah, 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 blah. And just list out their deck list in your head. And you think, I'm going to play around all of these cards, as much as is possible. You have to balance it with not losing because you're playing too weirdly. But, I'm going to play around as many of these cards as I reasonably can in order to mitigate as much of my opponent's deck as possible. So how do we do that? That's a bit of a tall order, right? What I would recommend is you start with one card. It can be a card you particularly dislike in the game, a card that always kills you, a card that you go into each game crossing your fingers and hoping they don't have it, or whatever. It could just be like whatever the most upvoted please nerf this thread on Reddit is right now. As an example, a relevant example, I'm going to use Saurian Finality. I've got this Magmar deck that I shamelessly net decked from whoever it was that won the last Duelyst melee. This is pretty typical of current high tier Magmar decks, and it's a bunch of removal, powerful minions that also remove things, and then as the finisher, Saurian Finality at the top of the curve. So for anyone not familiar, here is the card. Basically, it heals you a bunch, stuns your opponent, buffs you, and then knocks everyone down in mana. So the idea is that you set up, you trade resources with them for a while, and then you play this card, and you're suddenly ahead on life. Your general is bigger than theirs, you have more power, and their ability to kill you on the backswing, as it were, is greatly reduced because they're knocked down to 4 or 5 mana crystals and can't mount that much of a defense. And from there, you can kind of continue snowballing your advantage while preventing them from comboing off. So, you have to play against Magma sometimes, currently quite a lot. What do you do? What do you do about Saurian Finality, right? How do you not lose to it? Well, one way is to make it unfavourable for them to cast the card. If I have Saurian Finality in my hand and my opponent has enough stuff on the board that they can attack me for a bunch of damage the next turn, I'm going to be more thinking to play removal spells instead, or run away and defend myself with something. Bonus points if there's a mix of units that don't die to one obvious or easy removal effect, or units that demand a removal effect that the Magma players already used, such as a bunch of Spelljammers when they've already used the Plasma Storm. How can we engineer these situations? We can start counting backwards in turns, right? I'm gonna refer to the 7 mana turn as turn 7 for the sake of argument. Let's call it mana 7 for the turn where you go into 7th mana, which is turn 5 for player 2 and turn 6 for player 1. But the Saurian Finality turn. So you can think, okay, on 7 mana, my opponent's going to play their Finality. So on my turn before that, I should play out some stuff that makes it threatening and difficult for them to cast Saurian Finality. So far, so good. But how do you make sure that you have stuff in your hand that is actually relevant for the situation? Let's think about it. What sort of units would be good that your opponent can't just ignore or brush aside? Something like a Sunsteel Defender would be great. It doesn't die to the attack on the Saurian Finality. Like, your opponent's going to gain a bunch of health, so if you play a medium-sized unit, they can just attack it and take a few damage. They'll probably have the room to do that. But something like a Sunsteel Defender or some high health unit like a Bright Moss Golem, something as simple as that, probably doesn't die to that attack, meaning you're a bit safer to run it out there and maybe body block with it, put it in your opponent's way, so it also prevents them from hitting you in the face, or just leave it hanging around threatening a counterattack. They could kill that with natural selection, so maybe we want a 2-drop as well. So our ideal situation is something like a 4-drop or a 5-drop that's big enough to not just die, or has force field, and some kind of cheaper creature to make natural selection worse. And maybe we'll position these in such a way that we're also playing around Mercantile Warbeast, because we can do that. We can spread out a little bit, so that maybe the 4-drop's close to the opponent and the 2-drop's further away, so they can't just kill it for free. And that also reduces the impact of them having a Mercantor, because they'll only kill one unit with it. So, we've made that decision, but now what, right? You have to make sure you have those cards in your hand, and you have to make sure that ideally your opponent doesn't have a board with which to kill them first. So maybe the turn before that, you want to play a removal spell. Magmar decks like this are very reactive. They don't have a whole lot of cards that they just play. It's mostly removal and answer cards and a couple of combo pieces or kind of tide turners like Drogon. They might play out a Lava Slasher, but it's not really that sort of deck. The idea is you have inevitability. If they've got Saurian Finality in their hand, they're probably not in that much of a rush to punch you in the face and win that way. They'll be doing that, but probably not enough that they feel the need to play a Lava Slasher out for no value, given how powerful the card can be. So if the turn before that you're just playing, say, Blood of Air, or some other removal spell, and clearing their previous Lava Slasher, or whatever 4-drop they played if they had one, even an artifact, like if you're just pinging their artifact with a, what's it called? Blood Tier Alchemist. That might be another acceptable turn. And perhaps you're drawing some cards with the rest of your mana, or playing out some inoffensive threat that they'll probably just kill, but... So what about the turn before that, right? Maybe you want to play out your early game stuff in such a way that you don't immediately lose to Plasma Storm. Or perhaps you want to bait your opponent's Plasma Storm. It's another way you can play around cards. You can say, I'm going to play out my early cheap stuff, get my opponent to spend mana Plasma Storming it, then play big things, so that their Saurian Finality doesn't work so well. And as you chase back these sequences, right, we've now gone basically all the way back to the start of the game. We're now looking to go something like play a 2-drop, play a Spelljammer, say, which is pretty expendable and nice against Plasma Storm. Opponent kills our stuff, we play something, they play Lava Slasher, we kill the Lava Slasher, they play nothing, maybe hit us in the face. We play our units, and then they go into their 7 mana turn. And now their Saurian Finality is awkward, because you've got a decent board. Because your opponent will probably have been hitting stuff with Varth for a while, they'll be on lowish life, so they can't just trivially... They heal 10 off the Saurian, but it's not particularly free for them to think about taking a lot of damage right after that. Especially as a lot of Duelyst decks can provide quite a lot of burst from even a couple of onboard minions. You can do a fair amount of damage. And although it might not kill your opponent immediately, you might get them the next turn if you're able to snowball a board advantage. The last thing, this deck is not really equipped to deal with multiple large minions. So if you can start your turn with minions in play, or at least threaten to, because they played Saurian Finality, and then you play another large minion, they're going to struggle more. Like, provided those minions don't die to Homeostatic Rebuke, of course. This is where things like your Sunsteel Defenders come in really handy, because they basically survive all of the Magmar removal. Yeah, so now we're looking at our opening hand and going, okay, I'm going to need this now, and this next turn, in order to set up for the mid game, where I can trade off from my opponent and try and kind of stay alive for a bit, and then find my way to my 4-drop and my 2-drop that I'm going to play before my opponent plays Saurian Finality. Maybe if you have a suitable 4-drop, you'll just keep it in your opening hand, and as long as you've got ways to spend your mana in the early turns, just hold on to it. Just keep it there. Or you've got some big, like, you've got a Grandmaster Zir or something that they'll have to deal with instead of playing Finality. And that doesn't die to a decent number of their kill spells. You can play that instead. Just some big bomb that doesn't die very easily. There's actually a lot of things that you can do to make it unappealing for them to play Finality. And then either they go for it, and you can take advantage of that because you set up a situation that was bad for them, or they don't go for it and you delayed their Saurian Finality, and now they're still on the back foot trying to kill your stuff, and ideally losing tempo, especially if they don't have a lot of Lava Slashes lying around. So this is, although it sounds complicated, you can achieve this with just normal cards. It does help if your deck has a bunch of stuff in it that is relatively resilient to magma removal or poor targets for it. Like 4/5s are quite awkward for them. Spelljammer is quite good. It dies to Plasma Storm, but otherwise is reasonably big, reasonably resilient. And of course, even if it dies, you drew a card, so it keeps you up. Things with Dying Wish, triggers can be really good as well. Like cards like Skippy, the new Vitruvian 3-drop. You don't care if it dies. So you can play that sort of stuff out early on to absorb their removal and try and stay ahead without falling too far behind on resources. It turns out there's a lot you can do in small ways, even on a budget or with relatively little experience, to mitigate what this deck can do. But if you can go beyond just putting cards in your deck that are quite good against them and actually thinking about, okay, on 7 mana, they're going to try and Finality me. How do I stop that? Then your win rate will go up because you'll be... If you're doing this and your opponent isn't, you've suddenly got a huge advantage on them over controlling the flow of the game because they're just playing their cards and you're predicting them. And it goes beyond that. Obviously your opponent is not a robot. They're a human being. They can do this too. They can play around your stuff. They can play around you trying to play around their stuff. Your opponent can expect you to try and mitigate Finality and just not play it. They can just replace it and hold on to it, but hold on to stuff to deal with the stuff that you play to deal with the Finality first. Maybe everyone watches this video now. It's like 15 levels of, well, if I play the thing that he plays around, that I play around, that he plays around, that can happen in theory. In practice, that doesn't. But your opponent is a living, breathing human being. That means that you can't necessarily predict their actions, nor should you treat them as essentially an NPC in your quest to become the best Duelyst player in the world, right? They're a person. But that has its advantages. If you can make it so that your opponent kind of feels awkward about playing a card, they'll reconsider their decision and they might not play it when you don't want them to. On the other hand, if you pressure them a bit and put down what looks like a good target for something, but is relatively expendable for you, you might bait them. This is another really good way of playing around things like AoEs. You can bait, say, a Plasma Storm by playing things like Ulquian and expendable Dervishes that encourage your opponent, come on, AoE me. Blow it up, blow it up. I've got all these creatures out, I'm attacking your life total, I'm getting in damage. Like, you have to blow all this stuff up, right? And you're just sitting there with 5 cards in your hand going, this is fine. They Plasma Storm, and you just redeploy with better stuff, now that they don't have Plasma Storm anymore. So, you can try and... Some of playing around cards, especially in a game like this where you're not... you can't interact on your opponent's turn, is all about trying to manipulate your opponent slightly into not doing the things you don't want them to do, or into doing the things at a time that's more convenient for you than it is for them. And that's... In one way, that's the essence of playing around cards, is anticipating your opponent's moves and trying to make them worse, or make them not want to do them, or make them want to do them too much when they shouldn't, but they don't know that they shouldn't, or they feel obliged to, they don't have a choice. The other thing about this and this is where we circle back to the start. At the beginning, I talked about, knowing your opponent's deck list offhand and all this. Once you've gotten the hang of playing around Saurian Finality, right, you look at your opening hand, you go, okay, my opponent's going to Saurian me on 7, how do I counter that? How do I set up a board that makes it unpalatable for them to Saurian me? Once you've gotten that down, add another card to the mix. You're like, okay, they've got Saurian Finality, I've got that down, I'm making that awkward. Now, how do I beat Lava Slasher? Right? And this from the same opponent. Like, how do I mitigate Lava Slasher on the way to mitigating Saurian Finality? And some of it is, I'll just put, 4 6s and 4 5s in my deck, and that makes Lava Slasher slightly worse, forces your opponent to trade in with their face, which gets in more face damage over the course of the game, which adds up very quickly. But, maybe I'll start thinking about, like, well, I'm going to play this unit that is a good Lava Slasher target, but I'm going to play it over here and then move away from it so that if my opponent Lava Slashes, I can run away from the 4-8 or whatever for a couple of turns before it catches up to me, which gives me time to deal with it, so I don't immediately have to worry about it trading with my next unit too. Or maybe you look at your opening hand, you go, I would like this 4-drop, but it's got 4 health. It dies the Lava Slasher. I'll replace it digging for a 5 health one or a 6 health one. Maybe you play obelisks that don't die to some of these things, and then you just have to worry about Plasma Storm. So now you're thinking about Saurian Finality and Lava Slasher. And you try and do them separately, or you can try and do them both at once. And once you've gotten the hang of doing them both at once, you can add another card to the mix. Okay, so I'm mitigating Lava Slasher reasonably well. I'm mitigating Saurian Finality well. Alright, but they get me with Homeostatic Rebuke now. How do I beat that? And again, you can tweak your deck, but you can also look at your opening hand and go, this dies to Rebuke, this dies to Rebuke. I'm not going to play out 2 4/4s in the same turn. I'm not going to go overboard on some like double Kinetic Surge Cryptographer play to make a huge board for my opponent to wipe it away from 3 mana. I'm going to play this one unit that maybe dies to it, and then this other unit that doesn't. Or I'll just replace the unit that dies to it and play an artifact instead, which blanks the removal spell. And slowly you can keep adding cards as you learn them, as you get used to them, as you get used to the matchup, as you get used to the meta in general, and as you get used to your own deck, which is another key part of this. You have to know your own ability to play around some of this stuff. You can gradually increase the number of cards and the number of different strategies that your opponent can have that you're taking into account. It gets more complicated when you're playing against something ambiguous. Like you're looking at your opening hand against, say, a Vitruvian player. It's not really obvious what they're going to be doing. They could be obelisks, golems, combo, control, aggro, like all sorts of weird stuff. And within any of those archetypes, there's a bunch of different cards they could have. But even then, you can focus on the obvious ones. Like, okay, I'm playing a slow control deck. They're Vitruvian. They probably have a Mara healer. That card's very bad for me. I'm going to hold on to this Eggmorph or this Demonic Lure or whatever, instead of replacing it early on when I might not need it. And then you start thinking, okay, I've got a Mara healer down. Now, a lot of Vitruvian decks play obelisks. Do I want to hold on to this Dispel? And then maybe if they play a Golem Metallurgist on turn 1, I'll just replace it then. Or, do I want to hold on to this Plasma Storm or this Polarity if you're going to get really keen? That kind of thing. So, even against opponents whose decks aren't immediately obvious from the beginning or from the first turn or two, you can still form heuristics. You can still make educated guesses of what they could have, and you can adapt your plan as they develop. The real sort of genius level version of this is to look at your hand and say, well, if they're golems, I'll do this, and if they're obelisks, I'll do this, and if there's something else, I'll do this. They play Flameblood Warlock on turn 1, I'll do this. And take all of these possibilities into account in the same replace decision. That's very hard, but it just comes with practice. Like, a lot of this is just allowing your brain to get used to handling slowly greater amounts of information and consequences. And that just comes with just playing, just practicing. And that's the fun part, so that's good. So, to wrap it up, playing around cards is the process of mitigating your opponent's plays for your own benefit and for their demise. You can do this by positioning in order to play around noted areas of effect, but mostly you want to be doing it strategically. You want to be thinking turns ahead. How can I set up a board position that mitigates card X? How can I make it unappealing for them to do Y? How can I keep my life total high enough so that I can't get burned out in one turn when they get to 8 mana? That's another one I haven't covered today. I'll probably get to that one in another video in itself. How do I make them not win, basically? How do I prevent them from killing me with their own proactive plan? And how do I do that while also advancing my own agenda? How do I play my own cards to do what I want to do, but in such a way that it makes their stuff a little bit worse? And my suggestion is that you pick a single card. If you're learning this, you pick a single card that's currently bothering you, that keeps getting you, and you know, go and have a think about like exactly what you can do about it. If anyone wants to ask me, I'm always happy to help, by the way. I'm available on Reddit or Discord or the comment section down there if you want tips. But I'd encourage you to try and think of your own solutions, because I certainly don't know everything. Try and think of ways that you can maybe tune your deck, but more importantly tune your play to mitigate whatever card it is you don't like, and then work to set that up in every game against them until you get used to the process, until it barely impacts your own game plan at all, and until you're comfortable with the decisions you have to make and the payoffs you have to make in order to do it. And then you add another card, and then another card, and so on, until now you're playing your opponent's deck better than they are, from the other side. That's the dream. So, that about wraps this up. I'm, as usual, over my imaginary time limit, but whatever. Who cares? I will, as I mentioned before, I took last week off just for the new expansion to settle in. So I'll hopefully be back to be doing these weekly now. So I will see you next week.